The order for dead slow ahead was ringing on the telegraph, but the RPM gauge stayed at 0. The ship was losing its steerage way. We were moving sideways because of the heavy wind and the tide. The rocky coastline was getting closer to the port side of the vessel every second. The bridge was calling for power, but the ship remained dead in the water. The master linkage for the fuel injection pumps had snapped. It was a steel bar about 1 inch thick. It broke right at the pivot point near the governor. The heavy metal rod fell against the engine block with a dull thud. Without that linkage, the fuel racks moved back to the stop position. The main engine died instantly and would not restart. This happened in 1984 on a bulk carrier entering the port of Narvik, Norway. I was the second engineer on that ship. We were carrying a full load of iron ore. This made the ship very heavy and hard to stop once it started moving. The engine room was hot, and the air smelled like burnt heavy fuel, oil and stale grease. It was my watch, and I was standing near the control console when the alarm started to scream. I walked over to the main gauge board. My boots made a clicking sound on the steel diamond plate floor. I wiped the glass of the RPM gauge with my thumb. The glass was greasy. The needle was pointing straight down at 0. It did not move. I looked at the air pressure gauge next. It showed 30 bars. We had compressed air, but no way to tell the engine to use the fuel. The vibration of the ship changed. Usually there is a steady thrumming in the floor. Now there was only the high-pitched whine of the auxiliary generators. Before I tell you about the struggle to fix the linkage, please take a moment to subscribe to these stories. Sharing these old memories helps keep our maritime history alive for the next generation of sailors. I grabbed my flashlight from my belt. The casing was made of heavy yellow plastic. I turned it on and pointed the beam toward the back of the engine. I saw the linkage bar. It was dangling by one bolt. The other end was resting on the floor plates. I walked closer. The heat from the engine block was pushing against my face. I could feel the sweat starting to run down my neck. I reached out and touched the linkage. It was too hot to hold for long. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my coveralls. I picked up the internal telephone. The handset was heavy and black. I pressed the button for the bridge. The captain answered on the first ring. He did not sound angry, but his voice was very tight. He told me the ship was drifting at 2 knots toward a shallow reef. He said we had less than 20 minutes before the hull touched the rocks. He asked me how long it would take to fix the engine. I told him I did not know yet. The chief engineer came down the ladder. He was moving fast for a man of his age. He did not say anything at first. He just looked at the broken rod. He took a rag from his pocket and wiped his forehead. The engine room was silent except for the sound of the cooling pumps. The silence made the situation feel much worse. It seemed impossible to fix a snapped steel rod in 20 minutes, but you won't believe how we managed to get the fuel flowing again. I went to the shadow board on the bulkhead. I looked for a spare linkage rod. We had spares for valves. We had spares for injectors. But we did not have a spare for the main governor linkage. It was a part that was never supposed to break. I felt a knot in my stomach. The floor plates beneath my feet felt steady, which was a bad sign. It meant we were not moving through the water at all. We were just a big piece of metal floating where the current wanted us to go. I looked at the broken ends of the rod. The metal was grainy and gray. Where it had snapped, it was a fatigue crack. It had been breaking slowly for years, and today it finally finished. I tried to push the fuel rack by hand. I put my palm against the cold steel of the rack and pushed toward the front of the ship. It moved, but it was very heavy. There were 8 large springs pushing back against me. As soon as I let go, the rack snapped back to the 0 position. The chief engineer called the third engineer and the motorman over. We all stood in a line near the fuel pumps. The heat was rising from the cylinder heads. It was about 45 degrees Celsius at that level of the engine. My shirt was sticking to my back. The third engineer tried to hold the rack open. He used both hands. He managed to push it to the half position. He held it there for 10 seconds. His arms started to shake. The springs were too strong. "We cannot hold it like this," the third engineer said. His voice was loud to get over the sound of the pumps. "The vibration will shake us off. If we slip, the engine will stop again." The chief engineer looked at the clock on the bulkhead. 5 minutes had passed since the engine stopped. We were now 15 minutes away from the rocks. I could Hear the hull making a low groaning sound? It was the sound of the ship rolling in the swell. When the ship is under power, you don't hear those sounds. When the engine is dead, the ship sounds like a haunted house. I looked around the engine room for something to use as a lever. I saw a long pry bar leaning against a pump. It was 4 feet long and made of solid steel. I picked it up. It was heavy. I tried to wedge it against the fuel rack and a support beam. It did not fit. The angle was wrong. I dropped the pry bar. It hit the deck with a loud clang that echoed through the whole room. The motorman came back with a roll of wire. It was thin copper wire used for electrical repairs. He tried to wrap it around the fuel rack handle to tie it open. He wrapped it 3 times and pulled. The wire snapped instantly. It was not strong enough to hold the tension of the fuel pumps. We needed something much stronger. The bridge rang the telegraph again. This time they moved the handle from dead slow to full ahead. They were getting desperate. The bell on the telegraph was loud. Clang, 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 clang. It felt like the sound was hitting me in the chest. We were out of time for a proper repair. We had to find a way to move that rack and keep it moved, or the ship was going to ground in the Norwegian fjords. The ship took a heavy roll to the starboard side. I had to grab a fuel line to keep from falling. My boots slipped on a small patch of oil. I smelled the salt air coming down through the ventilation trunking. That was a bad sign. It meant the wind was blowing hard directly into the engine room vents. The wind was pushing us faster toward the shore. I looked at the chief. His face was pale under the grease. He looked at the fuel racks. Then he looked at us. He knew the standard procedures would not work. We were in a position where we had to do something manual and dangerous. Get the emergency air bottles ready, the chief said. We are going to start the engine, and we are going to keep it running by hand. I did not understand how we could do that for long, but I ran to the air valves. My heart was not racing, but my hands were very cold despite the heat. I turned the large iron wheel of the main air valve. It was stiff. I had to use my whole body weight to turn it. I heard the hiss of the high-pressure air entering the starting manifold. The ship was silent, waiting for the surge of power that might not come. We were drifting into the narrowest part of the channel. I could see the dark shapes of the rocks through the small portholes on the upper level. We were less than 10 minutes from disaster. The chief engineer pointed at me and the motorman. He told us to stand on the middle platform right next to the fuel injection pumps. The pumps were large blocks of gray-painted steel. Each one had a heavy plunger that moved up and down. On the side of each pump was a rack. These racks were small metal rods with teeth. When you moved these racks, the engine got more fuel. Usually, the governor did this with the steel linkage that was now lying broken on the floor. "You too," the chief said. "You are the governor now." He wanted us to push the fuel racks by hand. I looked at the motorman. He was a young man from the Philippines. He looked scared. His hands were covered in black grease. I grabbed the first 4 racks. The motorman grabbed the other 4. The metal was oily. It was hard to get a good grip. I had to plant my feet wide on the steel grating. I could feel the sharp edges of the grating through the rubber soles of my boots. The chief went to the main control station. He put his hand on the starting air lever. This lever was a long piece of polished steel with a round knob on the end. He looked up at us. He raised one finger. That was the signal. I leaned my shoulder into the fuel racks. I pushed with all my strength. The springs were very stiff. They wanted to shut the fuel off. My muscles in my upper arms began to ache almost immediately. I could smell the sharp scent of clean diesel fuel and the heavy, earthy smell of the lubricating oil. The chief pulled the air lever. I heard a massive hiss as the compressed air rushed into the cylinders. The engine groaned. The giant pistons began to move slowly. The whole ship started to shake. This was not the normal vibration. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding. The air was being forced out of the indicator cocks with a loud sound. "Push!" the chief yelled. I pushed the racks forward. The engine caught. A cloud of black smoke blew out of the exhaust manifold gaskets near my head. It smelled bitter and made my eyes water. I blinked hard to see. The engine started to roar. Because we were holding the racks by hand, the engine was not running steady. It was surging. The RPM needle jumped from 40 up to 70, then back down to 50. The vibration was so strong it made my teeth rattle. The heat was becoming a problem. We were standing only inches away from the engine block. The cylinder heads were getting hot. I could feel the radiant heat baking my skin. It felt like standing too close to a large oven. I looked down at my hands. The grease on my knuckles was starting to smoke. I had to shift my grip every few seconds because the metal was getting too hot to touch. The bridge telegraph moved again. They saw the RPMs and realized we had some power. They moved the handle to slow ahead. On the bridge, they were trying to turn the bow of the ship away from the rocks. I could feel the ship leaning. We were in the turn, but without the governor, the engine was dangerous. If we pushed the racks too far, the engine would overspeed. If the engine overspeeded, the heavy flywheels could shatter. It would send pieces of steel through the hull like a bomb. It was a terrible choice. We had to give the engine enough fuel to move the ship. But if we gave it too much, we might blow up the engine room. If we gave it too little, the ship would hit the rocks and sink. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have risked the engine to save the hull? I looked at the motorman. He was struggling. He was shorter than me, and he had to reach higher to hold his 4 racks. His face was bright red. A drop of sweat fell from his chin and landed on the hot exhaust pipe. It turned into a tiny puff of steam instantly. The noise was so loud now that we could not talk. We had to use head signals. Suddenly, the ship hit a large swell. The bow lifted high, and then the stern dipped low into the water. The propeller went deep. This put a massive load on the engine. The RPMs dropped fast. The engine started to cough. I saw the chief engineer waving his arms wildly. He wanted more fuel. I leaned in and pushed the racks to the maximum full position. The engine responded with a deep thundering growl. The floor plates were jumping under my boots. I had to hold onto a guardrail with one hand and push the racks with the other. My fingers were cramping. The muscles in my hand were locking up into a tight ball. I tried to shake my hand out, but I couldn't let go of the fuel rack. If I let go, the engine would stop and we would lose the turn. Then, the false hope happened. We felt the ship straighten out. The vibration of the hull changed. It felt like we were back in deep water. The chief looked at the inclinometer. The ship was not rolling as much. He gave us a thumbs up. We thought we were safe. We thought the bridge had steered us into the middle of the channel. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I relaxed my muscles just a little bit, but then a loud crack echoed through the engine room. It was not the linkage this time, it was the emergency tripwire. The wild surging of the engine had caused the overspeed trip to trigger. The safety system thought the engine was spinning out of control. It pulled the fuel shutoff valves. The engine didn't just slow down, it died completely. The silence that followed was terrifying. The only sound was the whining of the turbochargers as they spun down. The chief looked at the bridge indicator. We were not in the clear. We had only turned a few degrees. The current was still pulling us toward the northern edge of the channel. Now we were even closer to the rocks than before. I looked out the small porthole. I could see the white foam of the waves breaking against the black stones. We were so close I could see the moss on the rocks. "The trip is jammed," the third engineer shouted. He was pointing at the mechanical trip reset lever. It was stuck in the tripped position. The surge had been so violent that the internal spring had snapped or wedged itself inside the casing. We couldn't just restart the engine now. Even if we held the racks, the fuel valves were locked shut. We were now less than 5 minutes from grounding. The captain was ringing the emergency bell on the bridge. That bell means prepare for impact. I could hear the sailors on deck running toward the lifeboats. The sound of their boots on the steel deck above us sounded like distant thunder. My hands were shaking. I looked at the heavy brass reset lever. I grabbed a copper hammer from the tool rack. I hit the lever as hard as I could. Clang! The hammer bounced off. The lever did not move. I hit it again. Clang! Nothing. The metal was jammed solid. The chief engineer looked at the wall. He saw the fire axe in its red glass case. He didn't grab the axe, but he looked at the heavy fire hoses nearby. He was thinking. I could see his mind working. We had no linkage. We had no governor. And now we had no fuel shutoff control. Everything was broken. We were drifting into the rocks, and we had no way to get fuel to the cylinders. Every standard tool in the engine room had failed us. We needed a way to bypass the entire fuel system and the governor. We needed a crazy idea, and we needed it in the next 2 minutes, or the ship was going to tear its bottom out on the Norwegian granite. I looked out the small, thick glass of the porthole. The rocks were no longer a distant threat. I could see the white water swirling around the jagged black edges of the reef. The ship was rolling more now because the water was becoming shallow. The waves were bouncing off the rocks and hitting the side of the hull. The sound was a rhythmic thump hiss that I could hear even over the auxiliary engines. The chief engineer grabbed me by the shoulder. His grip was very tight. He pointed toward the storage locker at the end of the workshop. He told me to get the 10-ton hydraulic porta-power jack. This was a heavy tool used for pushing steel plates or removing stuck bearings. It had a long hose and a hand pump. I ran across the oily floor. My boots were sliding, but I did not fall. I grabbed the heavy steel box. It weighed about 30 kilograms. I lugged it back to the main engine. The trip valve was the problem. It was a heavy brass plunger that had slammed shut. It was held down by a broken internal spring that was now wedged. We could not pull it up by hand. There was no room to get a pry bar under it. The chief decided we would use the hydraulic jack to force it open from above. We had to build a bridge over the valve. The motorman found 2 thick blocks of oak wood in the carpenter's store. He placed them on either side of the trip valve. Then we laid a heavy steel I-beam across the blocks. This gave us a solid base. I took the hydraulic cylinder out of the box. It was cold and covered in a thin layer of storage oil. I placed the cylinder on top of the brass plunger and braced it against the bottom of the I-beam. I started to pump the handle. Squeak, clunk, squeak, clunk. Every stroke of the pump moved the cylinder a few millimeters. I could see the pressure gauge rising. The needle moved past 100 bar, then 200. The steel I-beam started to groan under the pressure. I was worried it would snap and hit someone. I wiped the sweat out of my eyes with my sleeve. The air in the engine room was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and salt. Suddenly there was a loud pop. The jammed plunger moved down. We had forced the valve to open. The fuel path was clear again, but we still had the broken linkage. We still had no way for the governor to control the speed. The chief engineer looked at the third engineer. "You stay here," he said. "You watch the pressure on that jack. If it leaks, you pump it. Do not let that valve close." Then the chief turned to me and the motorman. He found a long piece of timber. It was a 4 by 4 inch beam of wood, about 6 feet long. It had been used for bracing cargo in the hold. He told us to use the wood as a lever. We wedged one end of the timber against a structural pipe. We pushed the middle of the timber against the fuel racks. This was better than using our hands. The wood gave us more leverage. It also kept us a few feet away from the burning heat of the cylinder heads. I could feel the rough texture of the wood through my gloves. It smelled like pine. It was a strange smell to have in a room full of oil and steel. "Ready?" the chief shouted. He went back to the control stand. He gave the engine a blast of starting air. The ship shook violently. The pistons began to move. I leaned my whole body weight against the wooden beam. I could feel the vibration of the engine traveling through the wood and into my ribs. It felt like my whole chest was buzzing. The engine fired. A massive cloud of soot came out of the indicator valves. It covered us in black dust. The noise was a steady, deafening boom, boom, boom. We were holding the engine at about 50 RPM. It was enough to give the rudder some power. I looked at the motorman. He was pushing the beam with me. We were both leaning forward at a 45-degree angle. Our boots were braced against a row of bolts on the floor plates. The heat was intense. I could see the paint on the engine block starting to blister and peel. The smell of burning paint was sharp and chemical. It made my throat feel dry. We stayed like that for 10 minutes. My legs were starting to shake from the effort. I could hear the captain on the bridge screaming through the voice pipe. He was telling us to give him more power. He needed to make a sharp turn to clear the final point of the channel. The chief engineer looked at us. He didn't say anything. He just pointed at the floor. He wanted us to dig in. I pushed harder. The wooden beam started to bend. I was afraid it would snap. If it snapped, we would fall forward onto the hot engine. I closed my eyes and just focused on the feeling of the vibration in my arms. The ship took a very heavy roll. This was the moment. We were passing the narrowest part of the rocks. I could hear the waves crashing. The sound was much louder now. It was a roar that competed with the engine. I felt the ship lean over to the starboard side. We were in the turn. The RPMs started to drop again because the ship was fighting the current. "Push!" the chief screamed. He wasn't using the telegraph now. He was just watching the engine. We put everything we had into that wooden beam. The wood made a creaking sound. Then the vibration changed. The ship felt lighter. The heavy rolling stopped and turned into a long, slow pitching motion. This meant we were back in the deep water of the open fjord. The waves were no longer bouncing off the rocks. We had cleared the point. The bridge telegraph rang. Clang, clang. It moved to half ahead. The captain knew we had control. We stayed in that position for another hour. We did not dare to let go of the wooden beam or the hydraulic jack. We held that engine together with a piece of cargo timber and a portable pump. When we finally reached the inner harbor, the tugboats came alongside. They put their thick lines on our bits. Only then did the chief tell us to stop. He pulled the fuel lever to the stop position. I let go of the wooden beam. I fell back onto the floor plates. I was covered in black soot and grease. My muscles felt like they were on fire. I just stayed there for a minute, breathing the cooler air. The silence was the best part. The engine was quiet. The ship was safe. We stayed at the pier in Narvik for 3 days. We found out that the linkage had a hidden flaw from the factory. The overspeed trip had jammed because a small piece of metal from the broken linkage had fallen into the mechanism. It was a 1 in a million accident. The company sent a new linkage and a new trip assembly by plane. We spent 48 hours straight installing the new parts and testing them. But I will never forget the feeling of that wooden beam in my hands. It was the only thing keeping 12,000 tons of steel from hitting the rocks. It was not a cinematic moment. It was just a lot of sweat, some heavy tools, and some very tired men. That is the reality of life at sea. Things break, and you have to use whatever is nearby to fix them. Sometimes you use a wrench, and sometimes you use a piece of wood. Have you ever had to fix something like this with your bare hands? Tell me your story in the comments.